My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, people have described me using very safe words: easygoing, reasonable, dependable. I was the kind of woman who showed up on time, handled details quietly, remembered what others forgot, and often stepped back so someone else could take the spotlight. If you met me casually, you might think I was gentle, maybe reserved, maybe someone who doesn't demand much from life. I've been underestimated in conversations where everyone competed to sound important. I've been treated like background support in situations where my name should have carried weight. And for years, the compliment I heard most often was that I was so patient, as if patience were the same thing as being fulfilled. This is not a story about revenge. It's not about shouting, public scenes, or humiliating someone for the sake of drama. This is a story about a long silence and about the moment I realized that silence could be a choice, and that choosing it intentionally could change everything. When people hear the title of this story, they often imagine a dramatic explosion, a single night where emotions boil over, voices rise, and everything falls apart at once. But that's not how my life shifted. It changed slowly, quietly, almost politely. It happened inside a marriage that looked stable from the outside. It happened among people who believed they knew me well. And it happened because I finally stopped convincing myself that things would improve on their own. At the center of this story is an anniversary dinner. Yes, there was humiliation, but those moments were not the beginning. And they weren't the most important part. What truly mattered were the years before that night, the jokes that landed wrong but were brushed off, the decisions made without my input, the way my discomfort was minimized and renamed as being too sensitive. Emotional injustice rarely looks like cruelty. More often, it looks like dismissal, like being talked over and told it wasn't intentional, like being relied on but not considered. And when you endure that long enough, people begin to mistake your endurance for agreement. They assume you will always be there, steady, useful, and quiet. I'm telling this story with honesty and restraint. I'm not here to turn anyone into a villain or myself into a flawless victim. I'm sharing it because I know how many people are living inside a silence like the one I lived in, telling themselves it's not serious enough to matter, that they're overthinking, that love means tolerating discomfort. What you're about to hear isn't loud, it isn't theatrical, but it is real. And if you've ever wondered when quiet strength slowly turns into quiet erasure, or what it feels like to choose yourself without making a scene, you may recognize parts of yourself in this story. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been praised for how much you can endure when all you really wanted was to be considered? For a long time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought of myself as useful. In my marriage, in our social circle, even within our families, I occupied a very specific position, one that didn't need to be discussed because everyone seemed to agree on it naturally. I was the one who handled logistics, the one who remembered reservations, followed up on emails, smoothed tension before it turned awkward. If something needed to be organized, I did it quietly. If someone felt uncomfortable, I noticed before they said anything. People liked having me around because I made things easier. My husband used to introduce me with a smile and a tone that sounded affectionate on the surface. "This is Eleanor," he'd say. "She keeps everything running." At first, I took pride in that. It felt like recognition, but over time, I realized that was the only way he ever described me. Not as someone with opinions or ambitions or depth, just function. At dinners with friends, conversations flowed over me like water over a stone. I was present, listening, nodding, occasionally asked for confirmation when someone needed a detail remembered correctly. When I spoke, people were polite. They didn't interrupt aggressively. It was subtler than that. They simply redirected the conversation elsewhere, as if my contribution had been a footnote rather than a chapter. And I adapt without consciously deciding to. I learned to speak less, to condense my thoughts, to wait for openings that rarely came. I told myself it was maturity, emotional intelligence. Not everyone needs to dominate the room, I thought. Someone has to be grounded. At home, that role became even more defined. I handled the unglamorous parts of life: bills, schedules, family obligations. My husband trusted me with those things completely, which he often framed as respect. "You're just better at that stuff," he'd say. "I don't know how you manage it all." What he didn't say, what no one said, was that managing everything left no space for me to be anything else. Decisions about our life together began happening around me instead of with me. Vacations planned based on his preferences. Commitments made before I was asked. I was informed, not consulted. And when I hesitated or raised a concern, it was treated like friction rather than feedback. "You're overthinking," he'd say lightly. "It's not a big deal," someone else would add. And because nothing sounded cruel, I questioned myself instead. From the outside, I was the perfect partner. Calm, supportive, reasonable. People admired how drama-free our relationship was. They told me how lucky my husband was to have someone so understanding. And every time I heard that, something in me tightened. Because I realized understanding had quietly replaced being understood. What's difficult to explain is that no one ever explicitly told me I didn't matter. There were no insults, no shouting, no obvious cruelty. That's what made it so easy to dismiss my own discomfort. How do you complain about something that doesn't leave visible marks? Instead, there was a gradual reshaping of expectations. I was expected to accommodate, to absorb, to adjust. And because I did those things well, they became permanent. I became the emotional buffer between my husband and the world. If he was stressed, I softened it. If he was rude, I reframed it. If he forgot something important, I reminded him quietly so no one else noticed. In doing so, I protected his image and slowly erased my own presence. The most painful part is that I participated in this. I told myself stories to justify it, that love meant compromise, that stability required flexibility, that speaking up too often would make me difficult. And somewhere along the way, I internalized the idea that my value came from how little I asked for. I wasn't unseen because I was weak. I was unseen because I made it easy. And when you make it easy for people to overlook you, they rarely question whether they should. At the time, I didn't think of this as a problem. I thought this was adulthood, partnership, normal. It would take much longer and much quieter moments for me to realize that being reliable, helpful, and endlessly patient had turned into a role I was never meant to live inside permanently. And by the time I noticed, everyone else had already grown very comfortable with who I was to them. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to alarm you. They sting briefly, then fade, leaving behind just enough discomfort to question whether it was real at all. We were at a casual dinner with friends. Nothing formal, no expectations, just a familiar restaurant, familiar faces. The kind of evening that blends into dozens of others. I remember because I'd chosen the place. Somewhere quiet, somewhere neutral. I always did. The conversation drifted easily until someone asked about a project I'd been working on at the nonprofit. It wasn't a big achievement, but it mattered to me. I had spent months coordinating resources, negotiating partnerships, solving problems no one else wanted to touch. When I started to answer, my husband cut in. Not sharply, not unkindly. "Oh, it's nothing too exciting," he said with a light laugh. "She's being modest, but it's mostly paperwork." There it was, small, casual, delivered with a smile. Everyone laughed politely and moved on. The moment passed so quickly that if I had objected, I would have been the one disrupting the mood. So I smiled too. I nodded. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting. But inside, something shifted. Not because he interrupted me. That happens. Not even because he minimized my work. People do that without thinking. What unsettled me was how natural it felt to him to define my experience for me, to decide what mattered, to close the door on my voice without noticing he'd done it. I remember sitting there, hands folded in my lap, listening to the conversation continue as if I hadn't been speaking at all. And I remember thinking, maybe I didn't explain it well. Maybe it really isn't interesting. Maybe I'm making something out of nothing. That night, when we got home, I considered mentioning it. I rehearsed the words in my head. Nothing accusatory, just a simple observation. "When you interrupted me earlier, it made me feel small." But the longer I stood in the kitchen, the more unnecessary it sounded. He hadn't meant any harm. He was probably just trying to keep the conversation light. And I didn't want to seem sensitive. I didn't want to become someone who takes things the wrong way. So I let it go. That was the real cut. Not the comment itself, but the way I dismissed my reaction to it. Over the next weeks, I noticed how easily that moment slid into memory as something insignificant. It didn't change how he spoke to me afterward. It didn't alter our routines, but it changed how I monitored myself. I became more careful about when I spoke in group settings. I simplified my answers. I waited to be asked directly. No one else noticed this adjustment. Why would they? It benefited everyone. Conversations stayed smooth. No one felt corrected or uncomfortable. Harmony was preserved. And yet, every so often, that dinner replayed in my mind, not with anger, but with confusion. I wondered why something so small had stayed with me. Why it surfaced at odd moments, like when I was writing emails late at night or folding laundry in silence. What I didn't understand then was that this was the first time I recognized a pattern forming, not in his behavior alone, but in the dynamic between us. A pattern where my role was to adapt quietly, and his role was to define the narrative. The people around us didn't see it because there was nothing dramatic to see. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive in an obvious way. He was charming, relaxed, confident. And I was accommodating enough that the imbalance never caused friction. But something had been established that night. My perspective was optional. And once something becomes optional, it becomes easy to overlook again. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a mental note to watch out. I simply adjusted, the way I always had. I told myself this was maturity, that relationships require flexibility, that not every moment needs to be addressed. What I didn't realize was that by letting that first small cut pass without acknowledgement, I taught everyone, including myself, that it was acceptable. And cuts like that don't stay singular for long. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. And that, I think, is how disrespect learns to survive, by arriving quietly and then waiting to be normalized. At first, the moments were spaced far apart, easy to excuse, easy to forget. A comment here, a decision there, each one small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together, they began to form a rhythm. My husband started answering questions directed at me. Not always, just often enough that it felt natural to him. If someone asked how my week had been, he'd summarize it before I could. If a friend wanted to know whether I was free for an event, he'd respond confidently, assuming my availability as if it were shared property. I noticed, but I didn't interrupt. Interrupting felt rude. Correcting him felt unnecessary. I told myself we were a unit now, that this was what partnership looked like. When plans changed, I was informed after the fact. Not because he meant to exclude me, but because he assumed I would adapt, and I did. I rearranged my schedule, shifted responsibilities, absorbed inconvenience with a practiced calm. Each time, I told myself it wasn't worth pushing back over something so small. There's a particular kind of rationalization that comes with emotional erosion. It sounds responsible, mature. It says things like, he didn't mean it. It's not intentional. I'm just more sensitive than he is. And because those thoughts don't sound like self-betrayal, they slip past your defenses. I became fluent in minimizing myself. If I felt overlooked, I softened it. If I felt hurt, I reframed it. If I felt anger, real anger, I swallowed it before it could take shape. Anger felt dangerous. It threatened the image of harmony I had worked so hard to maintain. In public, I was praised for how understanding I was. People commented on how lucky my husband was. They admired how calm I stayed, how I never made things uncomfortable. And each compliment reinforced the role I was playing, the woman who asks for nothing and gives endlessly. What no one saw was how much energy that restraint required. At home, my thoughts became quieter. I stopped offering opinions unless they were requested. I waited for cues before speaking. I edited myself mid-sentence, anticipating disinterest. Not because he told me to, but because experience had taught me what would happen if I didn't. The most unsettling part was how normal this all began to feel. The absence of consideration didn't register as absence anymore. It became the baseline. Once, during a family gathering, my husband joked about my obsessive need for structure. Everyone laughed. It wasn't cruel. It was framed as affection. I laughed too. But later that night, I lay awake thinking about how that trait, the one being mocked, was the very thing that kept our lives functioning. I considered telling him that the joke bothered me. But again, the familiar question surfaced. Is this really worth it? Why can't I just let things go? So I let it go. Each time I chose silence, I believed I was choosing peace. What I didn't see was that I was also teaching myself that my internal reactions were inconveniences, that my feelings were problems to be managed rather than signals to be honored. And slowly, without a single argument to mark the change, my sense of self began to shrink. I still performed well. I still showed up. I still fulfilled every role expected of me. On the outside, nothing was wrong, but internally, I had begun to disappear. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption that you will bend, that you will understand, that you will endure. And when those assumptions go unchallenged long enough, they solidify into entitlement. By the time I noticed how much ground I had given up, it felt too late to reclaim it without causing disruption. And disruption felt selfish, unnecessary, unkind. So I stayed quiet. I told myself this was just a phase, that relationships evolve, that my voice would find its way back when it mattered. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing disrespect, I was slowly training everyone, including myself, to believe that my voice never mattered enough to require space. And once that belief takes hold, it doesn't announce itself. It simply settles in. There comes a point when patterns stop feeling accidental. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly aware of my role. It revealed itself gradually, in the way people spoke around me, in what they expected without asking, in what they stopped offering altogether. Somewhere along the way, I had been assigned a position, not through a conversation, but through repetition. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the woman who would handle it. If a family event needed planning, everyone looked at me. If there was tension between people, I was the one asked to smooth it over. If something was forgotten, misplaced, or mishandled, it somehow landed back in my orbit. And because I handled these things well, no one questioned whether I should have to. My husband leaned into this more than anyone, not with malice, with confidence. He trusted that I would adjust, that I would catch what he dropped, that I would fill the gaps without needing acknowledgement. In his mind, this wasn't disrespect, it was efficiency. You're just better at these things, he'd say, as if that settled everything. The problem with being better is that it quickly becomes expected. And once something is expected, it stops being appreciated. I began to see how my role functioned for everyone else. I made life smoother, I absorbed discomfort, I kept things running quietly in the background. And in exchange, I was given praise for my patience, not for my insight, not for my contribution, but for how little I required in return. No one asked what it cost me. At social gatherings, people spoke freely, debated loudly, disagreed openly. I noticed how their voices carried weight, how interruptions were met with pushback, how opinions were defended. When I spoke, the tone shifted. People listened politely, then moved on. My words didn't invite response. They closed the topic. And slowly, I stopped offering anything that wasn't neutral. At home, my husband made decisions quickly, confidently. He didn't think to check with me because he assumed alignment. After all, I rarely objected. When I did, it was framed as hesitation, not perspective. You always worry too much, he'd say. Let's not overcomplicate this. And because I wanted to be easy to live with, I let it go. What I didn't realize was that by being endlessly accommodating, I had made myself predictable, safe, unthreatening. My presence no longer altered outcomes, it simply supported them. There's a quiet loneliness that comes with that kind of role. You are surrounded by people, yet unseen, needed, yet not considered, valued for your function, not your fullness. I told myself this was adulthood, that relationships naturally divide labor, that not everyone needs to lead. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about leadership, it was about agency. I was no longer participating in my own life, I was maintaining it. The moment this realization began to crystallize was subtle. I overheard my husband telling someone, "Eleanor's fine with whatever. She's flexible." He said it kindly, almost proudly, and I felt something in my chest tighten, not because it was untrue, but because it was complete. That was how I was known now, flexible, reliable, always fine. And in that label, there was no room for my limits, no space for my preferences, no expectation that I might want something different. I understood then that the role I'd been assigned wasn't something anyone planned. It was something I'd accepted piece by choosing comfort over clarity, by choosing peace over presence. And the most difficult truth was this: as long as I continued to perform that role flawlessly, no one would ever question whether it was fair. Not my husband, not our friends, not even me. But once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. And awareness, even quiet awareness, has a way of changing how you carry yourself. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a shift. But something in me began to loosen, and at the same time to harden. Because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was paying attention. There was no argument, no betrayal, no single sentence that split my life into before and after. The day something shifted looked ordinary from the outside, almost disappointingly so. That's why it took me a while to recognize it as the turning point. It was a weekday morning, the kind that repeats itself without variation. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, reviewing emails before work. My husband was rushing around distracted, talking more to himself than to me. At some point, he mentioned a weekend commitment he'd already agreed to, one that directly affected plans we had made weeks earlier. He said it casually, not apologetically, as if it were a detail, not a decision. I remember looking up at him, ready to respond the way I always did, to rearrange, to accommodate, to say okay without thinking. The word was already forming in my mouth, and then it stopped. Not because I was angry, not because I felt hurt in that moment, but because I felt something quieter and more unsettling: clarity. I realized I wasn't surprised. I realized I wasn't disappointed. I realized I wasn't even upset. I was simply done explaining this to myself. In that pause, that brief, almost invisible pause, I saw the pattern in its entirety, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a complete structure. A life where my preferences were considered flexible by default, where my time was adjustable, where my agreement was assumed, and I understood, with an almost clinical calm, that nothing in this dynamic would change unless I changed first. I said nothing. I nodded. I let him finish talking, and he left the house without noticing anything different. But something had shifted in me. For the rest of the day, I moved through my routines with a strange sense of detachment, not numbness, awareness. I noticed how often I preemptively adjusted my behavior, how quickly I dismissed my own impulses, how little space I allowed myself before yielding. It was unsettling seeing it so clearly. That evening, I didn't bring it up, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't need to anymore. The urge to confront had evaporated. In its place was a steady resolve to observe. For the first time, I stopped trying to fix the moment. I let it exist as evidence. Over the following days, I paid attention in a way I never had before. I listened to how often decisions were framed as done deals. I watched how easily my silence was interpreted as agreement. I noticed how little anyone checked in, because they'd learned they didn't have to. And with each observation, the emotional fog lifted further. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt self-respect waking up, slowly, cautiously, like something that had been asleep for a long time. There was a moment, a few nights later, when I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself longer than usual. Not critically, honestly, I saw someone capable, someone composed, someone who had been managing far more than she'd ever acknowledged. And I realized something else then, something important. I had been waiting for permission to matter. Permission to take up space, permission to disrupt comfort, permission to want something different. And that permission was never going to be granted. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't change how I behaved immediately. No one noticed it. But internally, a line had been crossed. I could no longer pretend this was just how things were. I could no longer unsee the cost of my quiet compliance. I didn't make promises to myself. I didn't plan an exit. I simply stopped abandoning my own perspective in real time. That was the beginning, not of an argument, not of a rebellion, but of a recalibration. And once that process starts, it doesn't reverse. After the shift, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit formed from years of smoothing edges and avoiding friction. I stayed quiet because it felt easier, kinder, safer. But now my silence was deliberate. And that difference, though invisible, altered everything. I stopped filling gaps automatically. When my husband forgot something, I didn't rush to compensate. When a plan was vaguely mentioned, I didn't clarify it on his behalf. I waited. I observed. I allowed moments of mild inconvenience to exist without rescuing anyone from them. No one commented on this change at first. They simply adjusted, assuming I was tired or distracted. My husband seemed mildly confused by the extra seconds of pause, where my answers used to arrive instantly. He asked, "Are you okay?" Once or twice, I said yes, and I was telling the truth. What I didn't do was explain. Explaining had always been my way of justifying my existence. Now, I let my presence speak through restraint. I listened more than ever, but differently. I paid attention not just to words, but to assumptions, to how often my input was skipped, to how frequently my agreement was taken for granted. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. My silence was still being read as compliance. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me strategic. I began to understand that people don't notice change unless it inconveniences them. As long as things continued to function, no one would question my internal transformation. And that suited me. At work, I applied the same principle. I stopped volunteering for every task. I completed my responsibilities efficiently, but I no longer overextended. I let deadlines and expectations be visible rather than absorbing them quietly, and something interesting happened. People began to take my time more seriously. At home, my husband misinterpreted my silence entirely. He saw it as peace, as acceptance, as a return to normal. He relaxed. He became more confident in his assumptions. That was the moment I understood the power of being underestimated. I wasn't withdrawing, I was repositioning. I spent more time alone, not dramatically, not pointedly, just enough to think clearly. I reviewed old emails, old financial records, patterns I had ignored, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. I asked myself questions I'd never allowed myself to ask before. What would my life look like if I didn't adjust first? What if my needs weren't optional? What if silence didn't mean surrender? The answers didn't arrive all at once, but each day something settled into place. There's a misconception that empowerment always looks like confrontation, that reclaiming yourself requires raising your voice. But for someone like me, raised on politeness and emotional regulation, power arrived through withholding my energy, my explanations, my immediate compliance. And because no one expected that from me, it went unnoticed. My husband continued to speak for both of us in social settings. I let him. I took mental notes. I watched how people responded. I saw how little resistance he anticipated from me, how natural it felt to assume my agreement. And I realized something important. As long as I played my old role, nothing would shift externally. But internally, I no longer belonged to that role. Silence, once a sign of erasure, had become a form of ownership. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't even planning an outcome. I was simply collecting clarity about myself, about the marriage, about what staying truly meant. And with that clarity came a quiet confidence. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that steadies your posture and sharpens your perception. I no longer felt the urge to be seen. I felt the need to be aligned. Others mistook this for weakness, for passivity, for indifference. They were wrong. I was choosing when and how to speak now. And when someone who has always filled the space stops doing so, the silence becomes noticeable, just not immediately. What they heard was nothing. What I felt was control returning. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. To them, I looked the same, calm, predictable, still handling what needed to be handled, still present at dinners, still polite in conversations, still reliable. My silence blended seamlessly with the version of me they were already comfortable with. That was the advantage, because while nothing seemed different on the surface, internally I had shifted from endurance to observation. I started paying attention to details I'd previously dismissed as irrelevant, not with suspicion or bitterness, but with precision. I noticed timelines. I noticed inconsistencies. I noticed how often responsibility flowed in one direction and how rarely acknowledgement followed. At home, I began reviewing our shared finances more carefully. I'd always managed the day-to-day, bills, subscriptions, household expenses, but now I zoomed out. I traced patterns. I looked at long-term allocations, retirement accounts, investments, not because I expected something to be wrong, but because I realized I'd never asked myself what security actually meant to me. What I found wasn't scandalous. It was simply uneven. My husband had prioritized flexibility for himself and stability from me. His career risks were cushioned by my predictability. My contributions were essential, but invisible, folded into the assumption that things would always work out. I documented quietly, not in secret, not obsessively, just methodically. I saved copies, I organized folders, I created clarity where there had only been trust. At work, something similar happened. I began noticing how often I was consulted after decisions were already made, how frequently my role was described in supportive terms rather than strategic ones. I didn't confront it. I adjusted my positioning. I asked better questions, I spoke less, but when I did, I was specific. People began to pause when I spoke. I also started investing in myself in small, almost invisible ways. I updated my credentials. I met with a financial advisor, framed as a routine check in. I reconnected with colleagues outside my immediate circle. Nothing dramatic, nothing that raised alarms. Preparation, I learned, doesn't require secrecy, it requires focus. What my husband didn't notice was how much less I was relying on him emotionally. I stopped seeking validation. I stopped narrating my internal world to make myself understood. That withdrawal created space, not between us physically, but between my sense of self and his perception of it. And in that space, I grew steadier. There were moments when he seemed to sense something, a faint shift in balance. He'd ask if everything was okay, or comment that I seemed distant. I reassured him calmly, not falsely. I was okay, just no longer available in the way I had been. He mistook my composure for contentment. What they all mistook was my patience. I was no longer waiting for things to improve. I was assessing whether they were acceptable. I read more about emotional labor, about financial autonomy, about how long-term patterns in relationships predict outcomes more accurately than intentions. None of this made me angry. It made me informed. And being informed changed how I carried myself. I stopped rushing. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been voiced. I allowed people to experience the natural consequences of their assumptions, not as punishment, as reality. The truth is, when you stop cushioning the world for others, the imbalance becomes visible, just not to the people benefiting from it. They didn't notice that I was building independence. They didn't notice that I was reclaiming authorship over my life. They didn't notice that my silence was no longer a blank space. It was a boundary. Because to them, I was still the same Eleanor. That's the danger of being underestimated for too long. When you finally shift, no one sees it coming. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was simply preparing myself to choose, fully, clearly, and without panic, if the moment ever came. And by the time that moment arrived, I was ready in ways they never imagined. The reveal didn't arrive with shock or triumph. There was no rush of adrenaline, no urge to call someone, no dramatic moment of realization where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, almost disappointingly so. I was sitting alone in the study one evening, papers spread neatly across the desk. Nothing secretive, nothing hidden, just information I had finally allowed myself to look at without filters, without excuses, without the assumption that love would automatically make things fair. And what I saw wasn't betrayal, it was leverage. Not in the manipulative sense people imagine, not something to weaponize or flaunt, but leverage in the structural sense. I saw clearly where the balance actually lay, where I had more autonomy than I'd believed, where my stability, my consistency, my years of invisible labor had created options I had never claimed. Financially, I was far more secure than I'd ever acknowledged. My income wasn't flashy, but it was steady. My credit was strong. My retirement accounts were healthy. The household functioned as smoothly as it did because I had built systems that worked, and those systems didn't depend on him as much as I'd once assumed. Emotionally, too, the picture sharpened. I realized that much of what I feared losing wasn't partnership. It was familiarity. The rhythm of a life I knew how to manage. The comfort of predictability. The identity of being the stable one. And once I named that, its hold weakened. The most sobering realization was this. I had been acting as if I had no choice, when in fact, I had simply been avoiding the cost of choosing. There was no celebration in that moment, no sense of victory, just clarity, calm, a steady understanding that the ground beneath me was more solid than I'd been told, and more solid than I told myself. I didn't confront my husband. I didn't hint. I didn't test the knowledge by pushing boundaries yet. I held it quietly, like you would hold a fragile but valuable object, not to hide it, but to respect it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Over the next days, the shift in me became even subtler. I wasn't more confident outwardly. I wasn't more assertive. But internally, the fear that had once guided my decisions was gone. I stopped asking myself, what if this falls apart? I started asking, what if this is all it ever becomes? That question changed everything. I realized I wasn't waiting for proof that things were bad enough to leave. I was waiting to see whether staying aligned with my values was still possible inside this structure. And the answer was becoming clearer by the day. My husband continued as before, confident, unquestioning, secure in the belief that I was steady, forgiving, endlessly flexible. He didn't notice the absence of anxiety in me because he had never known it was there. That's the strange thing about internal shifts. They don't announce themselves. They simply remove weight. I wasn't plotting an escape. I wasn't rehearsing confrontation. I was preparing myself for a single decision, one that would not be reversible once made. And preparation, I learned, isn't about anticipating every outcome. It's about knowing you can stand inside whichever one arrives. The private reveal wasn't about discovering something new. It was about finally seeing what had been true all along, that I was not trapped. I was not powerless. I was not dependent in the ways I'd been led to believe. I had simply been quiet. And quiet, when paired with clarity, becomes something else entirely. By the time I closed the folder and turned off the light, there was no urgency left in me. No need to rush. No need to explain. I knew the next step wouldn't come from anger or fear. It would come from alignment. And once you reach that place, the decision, whatever it is, stops feeling dramatic. It starts feeling inevitable. People often imagine a decision point as a crossroads filled with chaos. Voices in your head arguing, emotions pulling in opposite directions, urgency demanding action. For me, it was nothing like that. It was quiet, measured, almost still. By the time I reached it, I wasn't asking whether I could leave. That question had already been answered. The real question was whether I was willing to continue living a life where my presence was optional. I laid out the options carefully, the way I'd learned to do with everything else in my life. I could stay and keep managing the imbalance. I could ask for more, again knowing how easily those requests had been minimized in the past. I could explain my feelings, articulate patterns, hope for understanding, and accept the risk that nothing fundamental would change. Or I could choose myself without negotiation. That option scared me not because it was reckless, but because it was final. Once chosen, it wouldn't allow for reinterpretation or compromise. It would alter not just my marriage, but how people understood me. It would dismantle the role I'd been performing so reliably for so long. I took my time with this. Weeks passed, maybe longer. I observed how often my husband noticed me, only when something required handling. How rarely he checked in without prompting. How comfortable he was with the version of me that never disrupted him. I asked myself hard questions. If nothing changed, could I accept this life 10 years from now? Would I recognize myself? Would I respect the woman I was becoming? The answer was steady and unambiguous. No. This wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about acknowledging a truth I could no longer ignore. Staying would require continued self-erasure. Leaving would require courage, but not self-betrayal. The decision formed fully before I acted on it. By the time I made my first practical move, I was already emotionally resolved. There was no oscillation, no secret hope that something would intervene. I chose the irreversible option not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Once that choice was made internally, everything else became procedural: legal steps, financial planning, timelines. None of it felt overwhelming. I had been preparing without naming it. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was grief, yes, not for the relationship as it was, but for what I had hoped it could become. There was sadness for the years I had spent making myself smaller, but there was no panic, no regret. That's how I knew the decision was right. I didn't announce it. I didn't give ultimatums. I didn't seek reassurance. I simply moved forward, quietly aligning my actions with the truth I had already accepted. From the outside, nothing changed yet. Our routines continued. Dinners were eaten. Conversations remained surface level. My husband was relaxed, unaware that the foundation beneath him had shifted. And that wasn't cruelty, it was consequence. Because decisions like this aren't made in moments, they're made in accumulations. And once the accumulation reaches its threshold, the outcome is no longer a choice. It's a recognition. I didn't need to be understood to move forward. I only needed to stop abandoning myself, and that was the moment I crossed from contemplation into action. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to announce it. That surprised me. I had always imagined that choosing something irreversible would feel heavy, dramatic, that it would demand explanation, validation, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, it felt methodical, quiet, almost administrative. I began moving in silence, not to deceive anyone, but because clarity doesn't require witnesses. The first steps were practical. I consulted a lawyer under the guise of general information. Nothing confrontational, nothing urgent. I wanted to understand processes, timelines, realities. I asked questions the way I always had, calmly, thoroughly, without emotional charge. Knowledge has a way of neutralizing fear. and with each answer, I felt more grounded. I gathered documents I already had access to: financial statements, insurance policies, account records. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine to take. I didn't hide anything. I simply ensured that I was no longer operating from vagueness. At the same time, I began to subtly separate my life. Not physically, not yet, but structurally, I adjusted how my income was allocated. I redirected small, reasonable expenses. I created buffers. None of it would have raised suspicion, even if someone had been paying close attention. No one was. At home, I continued my routines. I cooked, I listened, I responded when spoken to, but I no longer overfunctioned. I didn't anticipate needs that weren't expressed. I didn't volunteer to fix things that weren't my responsibility. I let silence exist where it naturally arose. My husband interpreted this as peace. He seemed lighter, actually, less tension, less friction. He assumed that whatever distance he occasionally sensed was temporary, a mood, a phase. He had no reason to believe otherwise. I had spent years proving that I would always adjust. Socially, nothing shifted. Invitations still came through him. Plans were still made casually. I attended, smiled, contributed when appropriate. I didn't withdraw. I didn't provoke. Inside, though, I felt different. Not detached, resolved. There's a certain steadiness that comes when your actions finally align with your inner truth. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was executing a decision that had already been fully processed. At work, I maintained my professionalism. I didn't hint at personal upheaval. I continued performing well, but I also made sure my role was clearly documented, my contributions visible. Not for recognition, for continuity, for myself. People often think that big life changes announce themselves through chaos, but the most decisive periods of my life were the quietest. No tears in public, no dramatic confessions, just a sequence of intentional steps taken without emotional leakage. There were moments, late at night, alone, when the weight of what I was doing surfaced briefly. The finality of it, the knowledge that once I crossed a certain line, there would be no returning to the life I knew. In those moments, I didn't distract myself. I sat with the discomfort. I let it pass, and each time I emerged steadier. I wasn't moving quickly. I wasn't moving slowly. I was moving precisely. And because nothing outward had changed yet, no one noticed. That's the thing about moving in silence. The world continues to treat you as the person you used to be, even after you've stopped being her. By the time the external consequences began to surface, the internal work was already complete. I wasn't preparing to leave. I had already left, just not in a way anyone else could see yet. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as confusion. It started subtly, the way most realizations do when people aren't looking for them. My husband began to notice small absences, not of my presence, but of my compensation. Things he had never needed to think about before began to surface uncomfortably. A bill wasn't paid on time. A family obligation slipped through the cracks. A social plan fell apart because no one followed up. None of these things were dramatic. None of them were catastrophic, but they were unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity unsettles people more than loss. At first, he assumed it was a fluke. Then he assumed I was busy. Then quietly, he began to feel something he had never had to feel in our marriage before: inconvenience. He didn't blame me, not directly. Instead, he asked vague questions. Did you see that email? Weren't we supposed to handle this already? Did something change with the schedule? I answered honestly, calmly, briefly. Yes? No? I'm not sure. Each answer landed heavier than the one before, because it didn't come with the usual solution attached. I wasn't fixing things behind the scenes anymore. I was letting reality stand on its own. And reality, without my quiet intervention, was messier. He grew restless, slightly irritable, not angry, unsettled. The smoothness he'd come to rely on had disappeared, and he didn't know why. From his perspective, nothing should have changed. I was still there, still attentive, still polite. But the emotional labor I had once provided automatically was gone. Friends noticed it too, though they couldn't name it. Plans took longer to finalize. Conversations felt less curated. When awkwardness appeared, no one stepped in immediately to soften it. People felt the absence of ease without realizing who had been providing it all along. What's strange is that no one accused me of anything. Instead, they adjusted their expectations downward, unconsciously. They stopped assuming everything would work itself out. They became slightly more careful, slightly more alert. The structure had shifted. My husband began to ask for reassurance in ways he never had before, not directly, not vulnerably, but through small gestures, extra comments, casual check ins framed as jokes. "You're quiet lately," he said one evening, smiling. "You good?" I nodded. "I'm fine." And I was. But to him, fine had always meant available, absorbing, handling. Now it meant something else. He started paying closer attention to my routines, noticing when I left earlier, when I stayed out later, when I chose not to engage in conversations I once would have managed effortlessly. None of this alarmed him yet, but it unsettled him. The marriage hadn't broken, it had loosened, and looseness creates anxiety in systems built on assumption. I could feel his growing uncertainty. It's not about me leaving, but about his footing, about whether the ground beneath him was as solid as he believed. He didn't know what to call that feeling, so he didn't name it. Instead, he became more insistent without realizing it, more certain in his opinions, more dismissive of my pauses, as if doubling down on confidence might restore the old balance. It didn't, because the old balance depended on my participation, and I had quietly withdrawn it. The consequences were not punishment, they were exposure. Exposure of how much unseen work I had been doing. Exposure of how fragile normal becomes when one person stops carrying the weight alone. I watched this unfold without satisfaction and without guilt, not because I was cold, but because I had already processed the grief. This wasn't happening to him. It was happening because of reality. And reality, once allowed to operate without distortion, doesn't negotiate. By the time he sensed that something fundamental was off, the shift was already irreversible. He just didn't know it yet. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, his instincts were already outdated. At first, he tried small corrections, the kind people make when they believe a situation is still manageable. He became more attentive in surface level ways, asked if I wanted to go out to dinner, commented on how hard I worked, mentioned almost casually that we should check in more often. To him, these were repairs. To me, they were signals of panic arriving too late. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting to be treated better in isolated moments. I wasn't looking for reassurance or gestures. I had already moved past the phase where effort felt hopeful. The distance he sensed wasn't emotional withdrawal. It was finality forming. One evening, he tried to revisit an old dynamic, speaking confidently about future plans as if nothing had shifted. Vacations, career moves, long-term ideas, he spoke in the plural, assuming continuity. I listened quietly, the way I always had. But for the first time, the words didn't reach me. They hovered in the space between us, disconnected from reality. I realized then that he was speaking to a version of me that no longer existed. That's when urgency entered his behavior. He asked more direct questions, not about us, about me. "Are you happy? Did I do something? You know you can tell me if something's wrong." These questions would have mattered once. I would have seized them as openings. I would have carefully explained patterns, softened language, managed his reactions. But now, answering them honestly would have required reopening a door I had already closed. I didn't want to negotiate my dignity, so I answered truthfully but incompletely. "I'm okay. I've been thinking. I'm just tired." Each response unsettled him more than an argument would have. Because arguments imply investment. Silence implies conclusion. He tried reassurance next, promises framed broadly enough to avoid accountability. "I'll do better. Things have been stressful. We've just been out of sync." But there was no specificity, no recognition of the imbalance, no understanding of the cost I'd already paid. And that's when I knew, without doubt, that even if he wanted to change, he didn't know what to change, because he had never truly seen me. Panic doesn't make people reflective, it makes them reactive. He grew confused, then defensive. He alternated between affection and frustration, as if cycling through emotions might unlock the old version of me. But that version had been built on suppression, and I had dismantled her quietly. What's hardest for people to accept is that sometimes the point of no return isn't marked by anger, it's marked by calm. I wasn't trying to punish him by withholding reassurance. I simply didn't need reassurance anymore. My decision wasn't fueled by resentment, it was grounded in self-respect. And self-respect doesn't negotiate once it's fully awake. He asked finally if I was thinking about leaving. The question arrived late, and without the gravity it deserved. It was framed as possibility, not reality, as if naming it might prevent it. I looked at him, really looked, and felt no urge to soothe him. "I'm thinking about my life," I said. That answer frightened him more than a yes would have, because it meant the conversation was no longer centered on saving the marriage. It was centered on whether the marriage still deserved a place in my life. From that moment on, everything he did felt like a repair attempt on a structure that had already been condemned. The gestures were real, the concern was real, but relevance had passed. There is a stage in any ending where effort becomes noise, where apologies arrive after the listening window has closed, where fixing the symptom doesn't address the cost already incurred. This was that stage. And the most painful truth, for him and for many people, is that you don't lose someone when they stop loving you. You lose them when they stop explaining. By the time he understood that, the ending wasn't approaching. It had already arrived. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands, no dramatic reveal. It happened on an ordinary evening, in the quiet space between dinner and habit, the hour when people usually drift into distraction. I asked him to sit with me at the table. He looked relieved almost, as if this was the moment he'd been waiting for. The explanation, the release, the chance to fix things with the right words. I could see him preparing himself emotionally, bracing for something intense. What he didn't expect was how calm I was. I placed the envelope on the table between us. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't slammed down or hidden, just placed, deliberately. "These are divorce papers," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised both of us. He stared at the envelope, then at me, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the version of me he carried in his mind. The woman who endured, the woman who adjusted, the woman who always softened hard moments. He laughed softly at first, not mockingly, but reflexively, as if humor might diffuse what he couldn't yet process. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said. There was no anger in my tone, no accusation, just fact. He asked why. Of course he did. He wanted reasons, examples, something tangible he could argue with or apologize for. He wanted the kind of explanation that leaves room for negotiation. I didn't give him that. "I don't feel seen in this marriage," I said, "and I haven't for a long time." He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand, gently, not sharply. That small gesture carried more authority than any argument I'd ever made. "I'm not here to debate this," I continued. "I've already decided." That was the moment the imbalance finally registered. He asked if there was someone else. There wasn't. He asked if I was unhappy. I was, but not in the way he understood. He asked what he could do to fix it. And that was the question that made the answer unavoidable. "There isn't anything," I said, because fixing it would require going back in time to a point where I still believed my voice mattered here. Silence settled between us, heavy, unavoidable. He looked stunned. Not heartbroken, not angry, just disoriented, as if the ground had shifted without warning. I realized then that he had truly believed I would endure forever. That belief wasn't cruel, it was careless. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every slight. I didn't need to. This wasn't a trial, it was a conclusion. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I can't live inside a role where my presence is optional." He searched my face for emotion, anger, sadness, anything he could respond to. But what he found was resolve. That frightened him more than tears ever could have. He said he never meant to hurt me. I believed him. Intent, however, doesn't undo impact. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Not abruptly, simply clearly. "I'll be staying elsewhere for a while," I said. "My lawyer will handle the rest." He didn't follow me. He didn't argue. He just sat there, staring at the envelope, finally forced to confront a reality he had never imagined, that quiet people leave too. As I walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned, and that alignment was enough. Who I am now doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no transformation montage, no sudden reinvention, no need to prove anything to anyone. My life didn't become louder or more impressive. It became clearer. In the weeks after I left, people asked how I was doing. I gave simple answers. "I'm adjusting. I'm okay. I'm steady." And I meant them. The absence of constant emotional negotiation created space I didn't realize I'd been missing. What surprised me most was how quickly my nervous system settled. I slept through the night. I ate when I was hungry, not when it was convenient. I made decisions without mentally rehearsing how someone else might receive them. That alone felt revolutionary. I didn't miss the marriage the way people expect you to miss a marriage. I didn't ache for reconciliation. What I mourned was the version of myself I had postponed, the woman I kept telling myself I would become later, once things were easier, once I was asked, once I was allowed. Later had arrived quietly. I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I took up the space my body occupied without apology. I spoke when I had something to say and stayed silent when I didn't. Not out of self-erasure, but choice. Silence no longer meant disappearance. It meant discernment. People responded to me differently too. Not because I demanded respect, but because I no longer negotiated my own worth. There's a subtle shift that happens when you stop explaining yourself. Conversations recalibrate. Boundaries clarify themselves without needing to be announced. I didn't become harder, I became more precise. I was still kind, still thoughtful, still attentive, but I was no longer endlessly available. My energy had edges now, and those edges protected me. Sometimes I thought about my former husband, not with bitterness, but with distance. I understood now that he hadn't set out to diminish me. He had simply grown accustomed to a version of me that required nothing in return. When that version disappeared, he didn't know how to relate to the woman who remained. That was no longer my responsibility. The most important change wasn't external. It was internal authorship. I stopped waiting to be chosen. I stopped waiting to be understood. I stopped waiting to be invited into my own life. I chose myself without asking for permission, and the world adjusted accordingly. There were moments of loneliness, yes, but they were clean. Not the lonely feeling of being unseen while accompanied, but the honest solitude of becoming someone new. I preferred that. I learned that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or seek witnesses. It simply refuses to stay where it is not honored. If I could name the core of who I am now, it would be this: self-aligned. Not perfect, not healed in every way, but awake. And that awakening didn't come from anger or triumph. It came from a quiet, steady decision to no longer live as a supporting character in my own life. I want to end this story carefully, because the wrong ending would turn it into something it was never meant to be. This is not a story that ends with victory. It ends with truth. There was no moment where I felt triumphant. No satisfaction in watching someone else struggle to understand what they had lost. If anything, what I felt was relief. The kind that comes when you stop carrying a weight you didn't realize you'd normalized. What this experience taught me is something many of us are never warned about. Endurance can become a trap when it replaces self-respect. We're often praised, especially women, for being patient, flexible, understanding, low maintenance. Those traits are framed as virtues, and they are until they become expectations, until they turn into roles that erase your voice instead of honoring your strength. No one sat me down and told me I didn't matter. No one demanded that I shrink. I simply made it easy for others to forget to ask. And that's the quiet danger. Emotional injustice doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as comfort, as routine, as being fine with whatever. And when you live inside that long enough, you start to confuse survival with loyalty. The night I served those divorce papers wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't meant to humiliate. It was an act of alignment, a boundary drawn not in anger, but in clarity. He thought I would endure forever. That night, I chose myself, not because I stopped loving, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because staying would have required me to continue abandoning parts of myself I could no longer pretend were optional. If there is one moral in this story, it's this: you do not need to be loud to be done. You do not need to justify your exit with spectacle or suffering. You do not need permission to leave a place where you are consistently unseen. Sometimes the most powerful decision you will ever make is the quiet one, the one you make after listening to yourself for the first time in years. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, the minimization, the rationalizing, the slow disappearance, I want you to know something. Clarity doesn't always arrive as pain. Sometimes it arrives as calm. And calm is not a sign that nothing is wrong. It's often a sign that you're finally done negotiating with yourself. I didn't tell this story to tell you what to do. I told it to remind you that your voice doesn't have to be raised to be valid, and your boundaries don't need witnesses to be real. So, I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. At what point does patience stop being a virtue and start becoming self-erasure? That question changed my life. It might be worth sitting with in yours.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.